Hi, welcome to Elv Needleworks. I'm Elv and today we'll be going over some crochet and knitting tool basics. I'll be going over crochet tools, knitting tools, and some accessories that I think work for both, and all the timestamps for that will be down in the description. First up, I'm going to start off with a standard crochet hook. When I say standard crochet hook, I'm talking about a 5 to 6 inch long tool with a hook at one end, a blunt end on the other, and usually a flat portion just off center to aid with holding it. This standard crochet hook comes in a few variations. One of the main variations is material. Crochet hooks can come in wood, plastic, or metal. A metal crochet hook is usually made from aluminum or aluminium, as some of my friends might say. Also generally low cost and easy to find. Plastic hooks are probably my least favorite type of crochet hook. They are a very cheap option, but they are also very slippery and not very durable. I often find that plastic crochet hooks will bend or break with just a little bit of time. My favorite is probably the metal crochet hooks. Metal crochet hooks are probably the most common crochet hook that you're going to find. I do also like wood crochet hooks, but I find that they are more expensive and the wood in the hook area does wear down over time. That wearing down of the wood takes a very long time though, so I wouldn't really factor that into buying myself a nice set of hooks. Another thing you're going to notice when looking at a standard crochet hook is the hook itself. Now, there's going to be very subtle variations between different hooks. I would say that the tip of the hook comes in two different shapes, pointier and then rounded. Most of the time I find that this doesn't make a difference. However, I do find that when I'm having issues with the yarn splitting as I am working with it, switching to a blunter ended crochet hook helps quite a bit with that. As for the shape of the underside of the hook, I find that there's a lot of variation in depth from brand to brand, and sometimes even variation in depth in the same brand over time. This one is definitely more of a personal preference. You'll find shallower hooks, you'll find deeper hooks. I usually go for something around in the middle. Personally, I just experimented with a couple of different depths until I found something that I liked best. One of the last things to keep in mind shape-wise for crochet hooks is the shape of the throat. The throat of the crochet hook is right here in between the grip and the hook. There are two basic shapes that you're going to see. One is going to be the inline crochet hook, where the crochet hook is the same width from the end of the hook to the grip. The other shape that you're going to see is a tapered crochet hook, where it is wider by the grip and narrower up by the hook. Personally, I prefer the tapered crochet hook, as I find that the tapered design is a little bit easier to get in and out of stitches. Overall, I would say all of the shape differences and material differences are up to personal preference. Each shape and material choice can affect your tension slightly, so just keep this in mind while making your crochet hook decisions. In this same sort of basic crochet hook category, you're also going to see quite a few different handle shapes. I wouldn't consider these a standard crochet hook. You will be seeing, of course, variation in the hook shapes, similar to the standard hook, but the main thing we're focusing on here is the handle shapes. There are quite a few different crochet hook handle shapes. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of these because I personally do not like them. You will see these grips made out of a huge number of different materials, from rubbers, silicones, clays, wood. Here I have two different examples to show you. One is a flatter grip made out of plastic, and the other is a rounded grip made out of wood. Personally, I don't really mind these wood ones because it still has that flat metal grip portion that you see on most crochet hooks. I find it far more comfortable to use just a standard metal crochet hook than any ergonomic handle that I've tried. This may be different for you. There is a huge variety in ergonomic handle shapes made from a huge variety of materials. It will take a little bit of trial and error to find what works for you. Everyone has a different preference based on how they hold their hook. You could also have different physical requirements that make an ergonomic hook better for you. This flat plastic crochet hook also has another interesting feature that I just wanted to highlight here. It is a light up crochet hook. A lot of people like light up crochet hooks for working with a dark yarn. I personally found it really distracting and harder to look at because as I'm working, I find that I'm looking directly at the light of the hook more so than I am at my work. Dark yarn is pretty difficult to work with though, so if you find yourself struggling to see your stitches, I would recommend just picking one up and trying it out for a bit. Another type of hook I'd like to touch on in this ergonomic crochet hook category is the interchangeable head crochet hook. This is a crochet hook that comes with one handle and a whole bunch of different crochet hook heads in different sizes that can just be swapped out. These interchangeable ergonomic crochet hook kits can be a cost-effective way to get a lot of sizes with a comfortable handle. A lot of the price in these ergonomic crochet hooks comes from the handle itself, so being able to switch out the end is fantastic. If you are looking at this kind of hook, I would recommend doing a little bit of extra research, because I do find that some of the cheaper or lower end interchangeable crochet hooks tend to pop out while I'm working. If you've ever been at a thrift store looking for a good deal on crochet hooks, you might have seen something like this. These are Tunisian crochet hooks. Tunisian crochet is a specific type of crochet that I would say is almost somewhere in between crocheting and knitting. That is a bit of a rough description, but when working with Tunisian crochet, your stitches are worked in sort of a two-step process. First, starting from the right, if you're right-handed, you'll work picking up stitches all the way from right to left. Once you reach the end, you'll have picked up one loop for every stitch across the full length of your work. That is where the length of these hooks really comes in handy, because you can have quite a few stitches on your hook at once. The next step in Tunisian crochet is working back across from left to right, finishing off each stitch and going back down to one live stitch at the end of the row. Here you'll see I have two different kinds of Tunisian crochet hook. One has an end like a knitting needle, which stops the loops from falling off of the end of the hook. The other is a little bit more interesting, at least to me. It is a double-ended crochet hook. Now, this works perfectly fine for traditional Tunisian crochet, but if you use multiple double-sided crochet hooks at once, you can work Tunisian crochet in the round. Another type of Tunisian crochet hook that I unfortunately do not have an example of is more similar to a circular needle in knitting. It has the hook portion at one end and then a plastic cable connected to it. Some of these have another hook at the end, some of them just have a stopper, but this is great if you're working on something like, say, a Tunisian crochet blanket where you need to have upwards of 100 stitches on your hook at once. Now that we've talked a little bit about the material and shape of hooks, let's discuss the sizing. If you're in the US, you've likely heard up to and beyond 3 different ways of categorizing the size of crochet hooks. You'll know the metric system, which is measured in millimeters, the letter system, and then the US number system. I have also included the UK number system on my chart here. One of the things that you're going to notice when looking at this chart is that there is a weird amount of overlap with all the sizing systems. The metric system is the most straightforward and most accurate way to know the size of your crochet hook. This sizing system is just a measurement of the diameter of the hook in millimeters. The letter system, the US numbering system, and the UK system are all based on this metric system. However, as you may have noticed from the chart, there's quite a bit of overlap. So let's take a closer look at that overlap and understand the flaws of some of these systems. Let us look now at these 3 crochet hooks that I have here. You'll notice that two of them are 9mm crochet hooks, meaning that the diameter of the hook itself is 9mm. You'll also notice that one is a size M hook and one is a size N hook. This is because the lettering system, the US numbering system and the UK numbering system are not precisely standardized across brands. You'll also see that although two of the hooks are labeled as size N crochet hooks, one of them is 9mm and one of them is 10mm. This means that one of my M hooks and one of my N hooks are the same size, while two of my N hooks are not the same size. This is confusing. The most accurate number on your hook is always going to be the metric millimeter number. It is a direct measurement of your hook. I do have quite a few crochet hooks that have the letter system on them with no millimeter measurement, and some that have the letter and number, but again, no measurement on them. Most of the time I find that these inaccuracies aren't quite enough to cause me problems, but it does come up. When working with a new pattern, I always double check the millimeter measurement that's listed on the pattern. And I write patterns, although I do generally work using the letter system, I always make sure to include the millimeter measurement of my hooks as well, just in case someone out there has a 4.25mm G hook while I'm using a 4mm G hook. Another thing I do want to touch on briefly is that the UK number and US number that correlates with the metric sizing is the same for crochet hooks and knitting needles. You'll notice that most yarn labels will list a recommended crochet hook size, but it's possible that it will be written as a letter, a number, or in the metric size, which is why I always like to have a chart on me so I know exactly what I'm supposed to be using. A link to a downloadable image of this chart will be in the description below. It is now time for us to take a look at knitting needles. I do want to start out with talking about knitting needle sizing. I have made a chart here that has a few of the different ways that knitting needles can be measured on it. Knitting needles can be measured using the metric system, or the US and UK have numbers that are assigned to certain millimeter measurements. You'll notice that crochet hooks are on the end here too. Crochet and knitting needles use some of the same systems for measurement. The only one on this chart that doesn't apply to knitting needles is the letter measurement. That is just for crochet. One of the things you're going to notice is a couple of gaps in the US and UK sizing systems, as well as some overlap. You'll notice that the 7 to 8mm range is completely unrepresented in the UK sizing system. Because of this, the metric sizing system is the most accurate way to measure your knitting needle sizes. The metric system is essentially just a measurement of the diameter of your knitting needles. Hi, honey. Thank you. Now that we've talked about the sizing, let's talk about the material. Your typical knitting needle, the one that most people think about, is a straight knitting needle. These have a pointed end and then a blunt end on the other side. The blunt end will come in a few different shapes. This basically just ensures that your stitches do not fall off of the needle on that side. You'll also find these made out of a few different materials. What you'll see here is some wood needles, some plastic ones, and some metal ones. I find that for straight needles, my preference is to use metal needles. I find plastic to be rather slippery, and I find that wood and plastic needles at smaller sizes are rather bendy and are prone to breaking. Needles also come in a variety of lengths. The main two sizes that I see are 14-inch needles and 10-inch needles. The length of needle that you will want is going to depend on each individual project. Generally, I find that there's not a lot of projects that need a 14-inch versus a 10-inch, so I tend to get just whatever's available. Metal needles are generally made out of aluminum, but there are some that come with steel tips. I really like steel tip needles. The steel tip ensures that the end of the needle is much stronger than your typical fully aluminum needle. I would love to get steel tip needles for all of my sizes, but they're a bit expensive, so I do tend to just stick with fully aluminum needles. Knitting needles do come in quite a few different shapes. More shapes, I would say, than crochet hooks do. This is because when you're working with knitting, you have a lot more active stitches at one time than in crochet. In crochet, you typically tend to have 2 to 3 active hoops at a time, while in knitting, you tend to have the full row of stitches active at any one time. This means that when you're working in the round, you need a specialized type of needle. These needles come in 2 categories. There are circular needles and there are double-pointed needles. Circular needles also come in wood, metal, bamboo, or plastic. These needles consist of having that aforementioned material in a shorter length at both ends with a flexible plastic cord between them. As for material on these, I personally prefer wood or bamboo, but as opposed to pretty much every other knitting needle, this is something where I don't really mind the plastic needles. This is because the plastic needles can be made in one piece with the cord, and I find that they're less prone to breaking. I am rather rough on my tools, but I have broken wooden circulars and metal circulars. However, I still would go with wood over plastic given the choice. All of the materials that knitting needles are made out of have slightly different properties when working with your yarn. It is to the point where you might find a difference in your gauge swatches if you are switching materials between your needles. If you are working on a project and you have to switch in between circulars and double-pointed needles, or between circulars and straight needles, I always make sure that I'm using the same material for both. Or that I do a gauge swatch for both and end up using different sizes and different materials to achieve the same gauge in the same pattern with the same yarn. For example, with plastic needles, I tend to knit much looser than I do with wood needles, which I would say is the material I would use to get the tightest gauge, with metal being somewhere in the middle of those two. Circular knitting needles also come in different lengths. These needles are also measured from tip to tip and not just the length of the plastic cord itself. When you are using circular needles for a project, you want to ensure that the length of your circulars is a few inches smaller than the project that you're working on. Going too small can crowd your stitches and make things a little bit difficult to deal with, as well as increase the likelihood of dropping stitches, and going too big will make it impossible. That being said, you can use certain techniques with overly long circulars to knit very small garments. The best example I can think of this is using the magic loop method for making socks. If you're the kind of person who works with a large variety of weights of yarn, you might want to consider purchasing some interchangeable circular knitting needles. These usually come in metal or wood, and the tips and different cord lengths are completely interchangeable. Circular needles are frequently used for large in-the-round projects like sweaters or even hats. I have also seen very long circular needles utilized in making blankets that are worked flat. This is because they're very long, so a large blanket with hundreds of stitches fits on the cord without too much crowding. Double-pointed needles, or DPNs, are also fantastic for working in the round. They are most often used on smaller items, such as hats, socks, or mittens. These also come in different materials, such as wood, metal, bamboo, and plastic. Personally, my favorite double-pointed needles are wood ones. I find plastic to be way too flexible and slippery, and I also find metal to be a bit too slippery for double-pointed needles as well. When you're working with double-pointed needles, you will have live stitches on 3 to 4 needles at once that are able to be moved off of the needle from both ends. So that slipperiness I find really detrimental to keeping all of my stitches from falling off the needle. Here you'll see that I have 2 different lengths of double-pointed needle. I have 5-inch needles and 7-inch needles. Typically, I would recommend getting the 7-inch double-pointed needles if you're looking to try them out. This length is great for things such as hats, socks, or mittens. These shorter needles I would consider to be a little bit more specialized. They're a little bit too short to use for a hat, but they are great for something like the fingers of a glove or the thumb on a mitten. The last type of knitting needle that I'm going to be looking at today is the cabling needle. The cabling needle is a bit more of a specialized tool. The cabling needle is used to hold your stitches to the front or back of your work while working cables. If you're new to cabling, I would recommend buying a couple different shapes of cabling needles and trying them out. This hook shape is my personal favorite for cabling needles, but they do come in a couple of different shapes. The reason I like this hook shape is because I can completely let go of my cabling needle while I'm working, and I don't really have to worry much about it falling out of my work. Another popular cable knitting shape is this one here. I have lost all of mine because they fall out of my work whenever I am making cables. This might not be a problem for you if you're the type of person who is able to hold on to 3 needles at once, but it is just not for me. Another thing I'd like to touch on here is these stitch holders. I actually like using the smaller ones as cabling needles too, especially if I'm doing rather large cables, because I can put those stitches onto this stitch holder and clip the end closed like a safety pin, which means that there is no way that those stitches are moving. These stitch holders are really great for putting a project into hibernation if you want to use the needles out of that project. As for the material of cabling needles and stitch holders, I don't really find that the different materials make much of a difference. I'm only working a few stitches off of the needle, and I find that the material of the working needle is the most important thing in terms of tension and slippage. Now I'd like to touch on some of the knitting and crochet accessories that I like to use and I find essential to the way that I work. The first thing that I want to mention is my thread snips. There's no problem really with using typical scissors for cutting your yarn, but I find it a lot easier and a lot more storage conscious to use thread cutters or thread snips. I tend to alternate between these two different styles. One of them just looks like a miniature pair of scissors, and the other is this sort of full handheld thread snips. The thread snips are particularly nice because they just use a gentle squeezing motion to cut the thread and don't require any of the fiddling that you might have with the other kind of snips. Another thing that I find essential to my kit is a thread needle. These needles are typically pretty thick and blunt at the tip. I'm showing you a metal one here, but they do also come in plastic. I do actually really like the plastic thread needles because I find that their flexibility is beneficial when I am trying to hide and weave in my ends. Unfortunately, that flexibility is also a bit problematic because I broke my plastic thread needle right before I went to film this. So I'm just using my metal thread needles now, which is fine. They work great. I just have broken a lot of plastic ones now. One of the things you also want to look at when you're looking at thread needles is the very tip of the needle. Some of them are more blunt and some of them are more sharp. I tend to prefer the blunt ones, but depending on the way that you work, you might prefer the sharper ones. I find that the sharper ones tend to split stitches and can sometimes get me a bit of a rougher appearance when I'm weaving in my ends. The next accessory that I want to mention is stitch markers. For years, I simply used a different color of yarn as a stitch marker, but after purchasing some, I am never going back. I would sort stitch markers into sort of 3 categories. You'll see variations on these 3, different sizes, slightly different shapes, but these are the ones that I have and the ones that I like. The first kind of stitch marker that I'm going to show you is a very pretty decorative one. I love these. They're cute, they add a little bit of whimsy to my projects, and they have this tiny lobster claw at the end that can be clipped on to any stitch at any point in the project. The only thing that I don't really love about them is that they can't be slipped over a needle. The lobster claw can be slipped over very small needles, but it's just too big to go over any of the bigger needles. These stitch markers are also typically made from metal, which means that they're fairly durable and last a bit. I have found that over time the charms will come off, but all stitch markers will break eventually, and honestly, I'm losing stitch markers way faster than I'm breaking them. They're just tiny and go everywhere. The next sort of category of stitch marker is these big plastic ones. These are very versatile. I would say they work really well with knitting and they work really well with crochet. These can also be clipped onto any spot in your work. I do find that they're a little bit bulkier than the sort of decorative ones. They're also a bit cheap looking. One of the things that I do like about them is that they can be slipped over larger needles. However, I do find that they can pop open and come off fairly easily. Which brings me to the last kind of stitch marker, which is these circular ones. The ones that I have are made out of a coated metal, so they're rather durable, and they are fantastic for slipping over needles. I absolutely love these. They're truly just really cute. The downside to these is that they can't be used in crochet, and sometimes you do run the risk of being knitted into your work. I haven't done it yet. I'm sure I will eventually, and I'm gonna need to get wire cutters to get them out, but for now, I love them. I just slip them from my left needle to my right needle, and that's it. Another benefit of these circular stitch markers is that they don't have any texture on them, meaning that they don't get caught on my work like the other kinds of stitch markers do, which is a huge plus to me. This is something that I love. I'd love if we could figure out a way to have stitch markers in all of these categories that wouldn't get caught on my yarn. And now onto a very important tool, which is a ruler. A ruler is extremely important to both knitting and crochet, as well as many other fiber-related crafts. It is how you determine the gauge of a project. It's how you know what size you want a project to be. I know it might feel a little bit silly for me to bring it up. Of course people need rulers, but I just want to show two of my favorite measuring devices. One of them is this soft tape measure. This is great for taking my measurements, for taking garment measurements, all of that. This one in particular is also longer than most, which is why I like it so much. This one goes up to 120 inches or 300 centimeters, which is twice as much as your standard soft measuring tape. This in particular comes in handy when measuring blankets or scarves, which are typically bigger than your standard 60-inch measuring tape. Another one of my favorite rulers to use with knitting and crochet is this clear quilting ruler. I find that this is fantastic for gauge swatching. I can lay the ruler down on top of my work and count my stitches through the ruler itself. Now you can just use a solid colored ruler and count your stitches next to it, but I just really like using the clear one and counting through it. I'm able to measure in two directions at once, and I'm actually considering getting an 8x8 clear quilting ruler just to measure my gauges for crochet and knitting. It would also be nice for quilting, but that's a different video. Another tool that almost doesn't count as a tool that I consider important is a case for all of your supplies. This could be an old pencil case, or it could be a case made just for your tools. Some people have ones that fit both their knitting and crochet together. I personally like keeping them separate. If you're in the market for a crochet or knitting case, or a combined crochet knitting case, I would make a list of all of the different things that you want to be stored in one case, and then look online for a case that looks like it has enough pockets or divisions for all of those different things. Since everyone's going to have such different things that they like out of their cases, I'm not going to go super in depth into this. I'm just going to show you my crochet case, my knitting case, and my third case that is mostly just for circulars and my one giant crochet hook that won't fit in my crochet case. What tools do you consider essential to your workflow? What tools would you never include in your bag? Would you be interested in seeing a video just about yarn? Comment down below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. If you're looking for more of my work, my username is elvneedleworks on most social media. If you'd like to support me or my work, please consider checking out Ravelry, where I have free and paid knitting and crochet patterns available for you. Recently, I've been working on putting together a Patreon. Currently, I am just trying to post regularly over there, mostly having work in progress posts, behind the scenes pictures, and sometimes sneak peeks of videos before they come out. Currently, I have a 7-day free trial if you want to just go over there and have a look at the type of content I've posted so far. Once again, thank you to you guys. I couldn't do this without you. Bye!